Hi, today we're going to be talking about Liber Nox. I think that's how you say it. Liber Nox is it's described as a traditional witch's grammary. It's written by Michael Howard, who is was a British witchcraft author. The book was published in 2014. Michael Howard's a bit of an interesting character. He was very involved in witchcraft communities for a really, really long time, decades. And he kind of shifted over time from Wicca to traditional witchcraft. But I do think it's really interesting to observe how the way he presents himself changes over the course of his career. Obviously, this book is towards the end of that career, but nonetheless. So a bit of background, I picked this book up secondhand at the Esoteric Bookshop in Melbourne several years ago. I think it must have been about 2015, so just after this book came out. I picked it up because it was cheap, basically. And at the time, there was a real resurgence in interest in traditional witchcraft. You were seeing a lot of it come up. I think it was around the time that Sarah Ann Lawless was also kind of at the peak of her popularity. So there was a lot of this kind of traditional witchcraft push. And I was just kind of curious because, you see a lot of these things happen on the internet that they're just not reflected, particularly in Australia. I mean, we're just so far away from everything. So I was curious, and this book just came up. My number one takeaway, to be honest, I haven't really got much out of this book, other than a reinforcement of just how silly the whole traditions concept is. Well, not concept, but the wars that people get involved in about traditions just seem so silly. I mean, have your traditions, whatever. That's fine. Obviously, traditions evolve as communities interact and whatever, but just don't waste your time arguing about why yours is more valid. It's not a good read. Like, it's not interesting to anyone except yourself, maybe, or people who aren't really practicing. So, positives, this book is clearly aimed at beginners, and it's essentially about the Sabbats. It's a heap of the author's opinions and research around the 8-spoked wheel of the year, though he won't call it that because he's not Wiccan. There is a small section at the back of the book which has outlines of a ritual, essentially to celebrate the Sabbats. It is basically it is a treatise on the Sabbats for his particular tradition of witchcraft. There is a fairly extensive reading list at the back, which is kind of nice. And I think that this book would be a really good grounding for those looking to get started in a form of traditional witchcraft, whatever that means to you. People who are looking to get into traditional witchcraft and celebrate the seasons or the Sabbath cycle and connect with the gods of this particular path, yeah, could be a good read for them. Like I said, it does have a practical section at the back, so there is a form of application involved in this book, but it is predominantly essays about various historical and cultural practices loosely associated with the Sabbats that the author likes or wanted to comment on. Yeah. So things that I didn't like so much about this book. As I said, it is a beginner's book, which I don't think is negative per se, except that the book makes zero effort to express that it is a beginner's book. Like, no person who's been practicing any form of witchcraft for more than like a month or maybe a year, I don't know, is going to be super invested in this unless they're caught up in the whole like Wicca is lame and like this is the real true one way of witchcraft that you need to come and join. I think anyone who's had actual experience on any path probably won't find this book that useful. going on from that, it's a little bit arrogant in its tone. It's kind of it's very sure of itself and dismissive of other things, and sort of has that, other traditions are lesser than this kind of mentality. I will forever have issues with books in any category who define themselves by bad mouthing things that they insist they aren't. This book, the introduction is essentially an essay on why Gardner's version of witchcraft is not witchcraft. I mean, to be fair, he's less dismissive than a lot of other traditional witches are. He doesn't outright call Gardner a fraud, but he basically says that Gardner was initiated into real witchcraft and then watered it down so that it would be more appealing to the public, and that, Michael Howard is now giving you the not watered down version of that witchcraft, which I just think is really an interesting way to start a book. It refers to itself as a grammary, but it's almost entirely informational, and a lot of that information is poorly anchored or difficult to press into the actual rituals presented by the author. If you stripped away all of the unnecessary stuff and just had the rituals and the supporting information, the book would be like a quarter of the size. Maybe that has something to do with, the publishing deal that the author had. I'm not sure, but I think there's a lot of superfluous stuff in here. The referencing throughout the text is really poor. While it does have a good reading list, which is something I mentioned as a positive, the reading list is given as a reference, bibliography, and further reading list all in one thing, which I just think is really stupid and problematic, because you don't really know what's like, how do I move forward from here, and this is what has informed this text. It's not good. Overall, I was pretty disappointed with this book. While it does have some interesting folkloric stuff in it, it isn't presented as folklore, and the lack of referencing combined with the arrogant tone of the author, never mind the way in which the author distorts things to support his own perspectives without clearly delineating between actual research references and personal opinion. Essentially, it made this impossible to read as an informational source. I haven't worked any of the rituals presented in this book because, as a tradition, the text just isn't relevant to me, and at least not at this point on my path. As I said, maybe this would be useful for particular beginners who are looking to move in a particular direction, but I think the author really could have kept out his opinions and venom, or at least made a point of saying, this is my opinion, because I think that some beginners maybe wouldn't be able to discern that, and because of the tone that he uses, I think some people would take him as an authority and just kind of swallow what he presents and maybe think that it was archaeologically supported when, I mean, it's tenuous, let's be real.